before thinking about how academia views wood engraving, I thought we should look at how wood engraving views academia. I must start with a confession of passion, perhaps mania. I've examined almost 60,000 wood engravings in the last few years, and they're taking over my mental landscape and dreams. My thoughts and daily life are starting to be illustrated by them. If someone talks about a plumbing job, I think of engravings of taps and stopcocks. Hearing news of a premature birth recently, what popped into my mind was a wood engraving of a tiny infant in a man's hand. If male friends suddenly appear with beards grafted on, I think of Rokesmith's fake beard in an illustration to Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. Even when writing this paragraph, when I put in the word mania, I saw a horrific, haunting illustration of mental ill health from a Victorian reprint of Samuel Warren's Passages of a Diary of a Late Physician. My thinking has become mediated by a distinctive and untimely artistic medium, one based not on photographic realism, but on stark black and white line. It's a process that is involuntary, pleasurable, and unsettling. The Dalziel brothers were the dominant London wood engraving firm of the Victorian period, when wood engraving was the medium for mass reproduction. Their output of around 54,000 prints from 1839 to 1893 illustrated everything from Trollope novels and new editions of Milton to mechanics, odontology, and chocolate advertisements. They produced many of the landmark images of the century, including all the illustrations to Lewis Carroll's Alice books, as well as numerous pre-Raphaelite illustrations to the landmark Mox and Tennyson of 1857. Mostly, the Dalziels engraved images after designs by other artists, including both lesser-known designers and household names like John Tenniel, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Frederick Leighton. And it's these who have been widely credited as authors of what were fundamentally collaborative productions. The usual procedure was for the designer to make a drawing on the woodblock, which the wood engraver followed when cutting out the print. The project I'm talking about today focuses on the Dalziel archive in the British Museum. It's an unparalleled and almost entirely visual archive covering the period 1839 to 93, when Dalziel kept a record of their whole oeuvre chronologically in albums. As a huge collection of unlisted proofs with little text, the archive has always been hard to navigate and rarely used. I've been cataloguing it in summary form and working with photographers at Sylph Editions who have produced photographs, and all this will soon be available on the British Museum's collections online. Today I want to highlight a few aspects of the project that have raised methodological questions that I see as more broadly relevant for Victorian studies. So my project focuses on Dalziel as a firm, and I investigate the role of the Victorian wood engraver and their business of artistically producing someone else's lines. Is this mechanics or creation? From drawing to autograph, the line is a pervasive element of concepts of artistic identity. The line is essential to aesthetics. Without it, there can be no boundary, no form, no artwork. Curling into letters and forms, the line connects writing and the image. An expressive gesture, the line links the body of the artist, their hands and eyes in particular, with the artwork as object. The mainstream Victorian wood engraver had the job of creating another person's line, and according to common beliefs of artistic identity, this is a paradox. My aim here is to explore this activity of making the other's line and to find a new method for understanding the wood engraver's supposedly mechanical labour in relation to the imaginative and figurative work that it produced. Print culture has been a dominant area in Victorian studies, and illustration studies is flourishing. Given the ubiquity of wood engravings and the resurgence of critical interest in them, it's striking that there's been very relatively little attention to the qualities of engraving as medium. Dalziel are perhaps the most famous wood engravers of the century. Their work's often mentioned in illustration studies, but scholarship that focuses on them is rare. There are some excellent essays by Lorraine Jansen-Koistra, Paul Goldman, Jerry Began. So I start with a fairly basic question about what happens when we look at a wood engraving as a wood engraving. How does that change it? What if, instead of considering an illustration in relation to the printed page, the book or the periodical or the market, and the political and social realities that the market exploited, we move in the other direction towards the engraver and the visually different, more abstract world of the woodblock. Wood engravers often worked at night. They used a globe filled with water to get just the right angle of light slanting across the block as they worked. I asked one of the, there's the globe. I asked one of the photographers I've been working with, Ornan Rotem, if he could convey how the blocks are dynamic objects that look different from different angles and in different lights. They're best seen at sunset. Not only an image matrix, but an object that seems to hold multiple shifting images within itself. This isn't a view accessible to mass readerships or viewers. It's the secret experience of the engravers and printers' offices, an accidental aspect that has nothing to do with their product. Similarly, engravers' proofs that sometimes bear the trace of the grain of the tree used to make them. You can see the tree grain going over there. Proofs are not the finished published product, but are often the most complete version of a print, with lines fully visible that in industrially printed versions stutter and falter. They are printed on more expensive paper, absorbing ink and allowing for smudgy depths instead of the harsh reflective barrier of the book page. I think it's time for a connoisseurial approach to commercial wood engravings, not to return to the old methods of Gleeson White or Forrest Reed, but to take up their questions in a way that's theoretically inflected and relevant to our interests today. This would be medium after print culture, perhaps. It would be to go behind the looking glass, to borrow Carroll's first title for the Alice sequel. Behind the looking glass is the wooden back of the mirror, which for me is the figure of the woodblock, part of the infrastructure that supports the fantastical world of print culture. A medium-focused approach allows the engraver's role in making the object to come out. Henry Morley's Stiff Beard is a story of a prince cursed with a hairstyle that precludes touch, food, and all social interaction. Seen with its literary text, the illustration shows a problematic hair type. It's part of the history of regulating bodies in the 19th century. There are many comparable examples. Here's a periodical proof. You can see where the designer has carefully whitened out a large amount of the performer's hair, showing where the engraver has made it too big and too wild. We could go on with that. Seen formally without text, Stiff Beard is a design fascinated with its own media status. In the prince's pathological hairstyle, linearity overtakes figuration. It's an explosion of medium. The discipline of wood engraving breaks out of the curved lines of realist draftsmanship. Curves and squiggles were really awkward to engrave. And the medium springs out as itself, sharp but soft tapering lines, straight and bold, and a brilliant use of white line to highlight the spikes. Since wood engravers usually didn't have responsibility for composition, an engraving-focused approach could mean closing down discussions of iconographic elements to focus solely on technique in the printmaking trade. But medium is never transparent. Engravers were collaborative workers who created the very fabric of these prints, which includes their creative content. And I think we need to find new methods of scholarship to discuss this. The fact that the engravers are following a preconceived design makes this a phenomenon that could be methodologically productive. It's been a long time since the humanities critiqued and rejected intentionist and unthinkingly psychobiographic ways of reading, but I know I won't be alone when I say that I find these very hard to get out of sometimes. An artist who creates a work after someone else's design, creating without freedom, severs intention and product in a productive and provocative way. Their relative lack of authority over their own creations demands a criticism willing to think imaginatively about the relationship between artist and art. In 1879, in a reaction to the capitalist success of Dalziel, as well as what he considered their flawed linear style, the radical engraver W.J. Linton critiqued the, quote, Dalziel rats. For Linton, Dalziel were leaders of the, quote, near enough facsimile school, which a well-trained Chinese rat would gnaw out with more nearness. The racism of this is astonishing, given that the woodblock printing was invented in China in the 9th century. The rat is also an interesting figure for the engraver, given the Pied Piper myth of the rat as a follower, just as the engraver follows the lines of the draftsman. We can imagine the tiny lines in the woodblock as architectural tunnels gnawed and travelled by rats. We can reclaim the rat, the capitalist rat, as a way of thinking about Dalziel's art project. Let's take one of their most famous works, Jabberwocky, which uses so many textures of line, it seems an advert for the engraver's art. The talons of the monster, a set of sharp engraving tools. The mouth of Jabberwocky is ratty. Its round lips and protruding teeth, remarkably like an image made in the same year and separated by just a few album pages for Charlotte Tucker's The Rambles of a Rat. John Ruskin's great critique of facsimile wood engraving, Ariadne Florentina, distinguishes between good use of the hand, in which the hand works in collaboration with the brain, and bad use of the hand, in which it is a purely mechanical instrument divorced from the brain. And good use of the hand he calls dexterity, and bad use of the hand sinisterity. He says, quote, "For indeed we want such a word in speaking of modern art. It is all full of sinisterity, hands independent of brains." That's his critique of the wood engraver. Ruskin, like W.J. Linton, is writing from a conventional perspective, privileging the solitary or independent artist. Dalziel, with its success at facsimile engraving, might be thought of as taking a different view, though it isn't one that they verbally articulated. The engraver's hand plays with line. Medium slyly transforms the hand of the painter into the hand of the wood engraver. The engraver's hand makes stories happen. It is the creator's. The engraver is gigantic in relation to the world of the woodblock. The hand meddles with text, the fingers take letters away. Where the figure of the hand reaches in from the margin, we can imagine the engraver touching the block and the reader, including the child reader, touching the page. This is also where reader and engraver tactilely reach out for each other. The engraver's hand makes the line that is not its own, that it didn't invent. When cutting, the engraver's technique is to avoid rather than autograph the designer's lines. Impossibly, Dalziel creates a self-portrait of the other. The engraver's hand is a mechanical instrument that refuses subordination. It has its own life. The Dalziel archive is visual, without letterpress or textual document, though with some brief annotation. The archive invites us to see illustration as image in a way that's unusual in a field that's orientated to word-image relations. As well as wood engravers' notes, sometimes, frustratingly, the albums contain later 20th century annotation that reinscribes textual contexts the album maker had left out. It has made me reflect on how reliant we are on textual sources simply for finding visual material. We approach illustration often through the names of certain designers or through particular books, periodicals, or authors. Inadequate metadata shapes our searches, and illustrators are often uncatalogued. Engravers very rarely catalogued, and I know that's a source of frustration for many. Keywords only return what we were already looking for. I found the album and the archive to be radically different finding aids in today's research culture. Approaching them materially, page by page, allows stories to emerge that I could never have found in a searchable database. Albums allow new material to emerge, those parasites in the archive we didn't know we were looking for, or wonderful illustrations that have been ignored because they were made for very boring books. They allow for a synchronic view of visual culture with an incredible sense of the material that lived together at one moment. So 1864 to 65 offers not just Carroll's Alice, Trollope's Can You Forgive Her, and Dickens's Our Mutual Friend, but the keep fit exercises that the novel's muscular heroes must have done to keep in shape, the drain pipes that structure the cities that feature in them, posters and covers for reprints, weird, haunting text, picture books, ancient sculpture, pre-Raphaelite art, Lifeboat Institute guides to resuscitation, frames, and much more. In the early albums that George and Edward Dalziel made in the 1840s, before they were joined by a sister, 2 brothers, and numerous employees, most prints are cut precisely around the edges of the picture, with large areas of white cut out from the middle. This was the first stage of proofing. Big white areas were not cut from the block, but left in place to protect the surface of the wood. They printed in black patches, resulting in a first proof too confusing for clients and collaborators. And I don't know how long it takes to notice the sheep in this image, but it took me quite a long time. To make a second clean proof, they made paper cutouts of these patches called overlays or frisquets, and they used these to mask those parts of the block. Dalziel sometimes takes pleasure in the accidental effects created in this process. Here, a pile of books takes on architectural qualities of the other images on the page, partly because the foreign black areas alter the bulk and form of the image. The lacework pictures that result from this process are a waste product of the engraver's office. Dalziel used these for their albums in the early years, including the time before their independent success, when they were working as jobbing engravers for other firms. This print is torn and damaged. It's signed with the name of a different engraver, Ebenezer Landels, who George and Edward Dalziel worked for. By rescuing this print from the rubbish and sticking it in the album that would become the first volume of their archive, the brothers laid claim to a work that could never otherwise have been attributed to them. It's a particularly interesting gesture when we think about how Dalziel swapped roles in this relation later on, employing other engravers to work under the Dalziel signature, hourly paid employees in a precarious market, who signed Dalziel, but whose contributions can sometimes be traced from annotations in the archive. I don't know if you can see Miss Byfield, but that's either Anne or Mary Byfield, who worked often as jobbing engravers for Dalziel. It's a reminder of how complicated authorship is within a collaborative capitalist structure. Throughout their 5 decades of work and beyond, when they negotiated exactly how the archive should be stored in the British Museum, the practice of archiving for Dalziel is connected with claiming artistic credit. This is a strangely artisanal fairy with his delicate eyelashes, muscular arms and smock. And this effect is created by the proofing process. The smudges on his shins look like they're indicators of poor dress, but they're actually signs of unfinished overlaying. In later impressions, the smudges disappear and the fairy, with his slippers and rings, looks much posher. Wood engraved, his wings are jutting wooden planks. Given how stiffly they're positioned, it seems impossible that he should sit in such comfort. It looks like he's smoking the arrow he's holding. It's an arrow, too, that is as sharp, I think, as a graving tool. The word protocols on an empty quiver is a clue that this is a political satire, but in the album, the protocols become the proofing protocols of the engraver. It turns out that Our Fairy was published on 4th December 1841 as a full-page illustration in Punch, the magazine that Landell's had co-founded that same year. Titled Cupid Out of Place, from a sketch made in the Palmerston Gallery, its subject is Lord Palmerston. He was newly out of place, having lost his position as Foreign Secretary. He was nicknamed Protocol Palmerston after a series of diplomatic and military interventions throughout the 30s. Because of his many love affairs, he was widely known as Cupid. The published impression has 5 figurines on its mantelpiece. See them better in this one. 3 of these have been torn away from Dalziel's proof, and together they stand as symbols of Palmerston's imperialist foreign policy acts involving Russia, France, Holland, Belgium, the Ottoman Empire, Egypt and China. I won't go into these, but for instance, the orientalizing figure on the left may recall the ongoing First Opium War, in which Britain fought to be able illegally to sell opium in China. The war and its goals are also remembered in the smoky and hallucinatory qualities of the picture as a whole. And working out the historical target of a satire is always satisfying, but in inviting us to see the elements of the design within a clearly defined symbology, the bear representing Russia, for example, it can close down other ways of reading. I mentioned what could be learnt from the archive as a synchronic picture of isolated years. I want to conclude with a different point about the long view the archive gives of a single family working for 54 years. It's hard to sum up the thousands of small ways Dalziel's story is materially told in their archive. There are the changes in structure and handwriting that indicate one album maker passing on to another. There are thin years and fat years, times of technical innovation, times of banal, repetitive work. At the end of the century, literary illustration degenerates with the introduction of process reproduction, which you can see on the left, and advertisements on the right begin to lead the way, both aesthetically and as pictorial narrative. You find in the albums calculations of hours that tell cumulative stories of jobbing engravers and the casual labour they were engaged in, or notes indicating electrotypes being sent out to global markets. Dalziel is often employed to remake their own work. For example, 1856 to 58 saw their production of Sir John Gilbert's illustrated Shakespeare on the left. The 833 proofs in the archive are astonishingly sharp and beautiful. Then in 1889 to 92, on the right, Dalziel brokered tiny process reproductions of these images for a reprint by Rutledge. The lines are no longer really visible, the texture and paper horrible. And we can only, wood engraving had ceased to be commercially viable at this point, and we can only imagine how depressing it must have been for them to spend time on the creation of terrible replicas of the work that they themselves had made 35 years before. The final albums include work renovating and upcycling old blocks. Pages include the lovely verb vignetted, indicating that the edges of a block have been butchered to conform with a more open style of illustration. In 1877, an employee called Williams recorded 2 hours of work correcting the genitals of an angel. There are numerous instances in the albums when the creative spirit of the album maker suddenly and obviously takes priority over any simple record keeping, when the chronological arrangement is interrupted for a good front page or a good spread. The most moving example for me is the final page of the last album from 1893. Dalziel was bankrupt and they knew it. The final page pasted in is a simple text bubble. Most of the pictorial elements that had surrounded the bubble have been masked. There is a disembodied hand holding an erased wine glass, the remnants of some fireworks, and the words, "To the new year," always looking ahead, even from beyond the brink. Thank you.